Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 28. De Numero Indorum, Novum Nihil sub sole. Placing the value of systems, when nothing became everything. In this episode, I'm going to talk about nothing. Well, kind of true. Our journey here is about the study of innovation in all its forms, from past to present, across time and space. In the study of innovation and progress, we have looked at relapse and regress. In our study more broadly of reality, and thus existence, we perhaps also need to pause to think of its opposite. Perhaps extending that saying less is more, today we talk about a form of nothing, because nothing is everything.
Let's start as usual with seeing what our ancient fictional friends are up to.
You might remember from episode 16 and episode 18 how Brian and Brenda set up the apparatus of trading and exchange with the invention of writing. Time has passed since, and now Steve has set up his own business as they're having some good output at their farm. It was first sheep, but now it's chickens because they're more numerous and it's easier to manage. Maybe that's not true, but this is just a fictional story, and I've never tried such a venture myself. Brenda has been helping them with account keeping. On a board on the wall, there is a column to record the inventory and sales. How many goods were there before market day? How many were sold on market day? And how many were left after? Business is brisk than ever, but one day something goes badly wrong. When Irene is trying to update the record after market day, the chickens come home to roost. No, just the reverse. Literally. They had 5 chickens, and they sold 5 chickens, which means they have no chickens left. But, in the name of the gods, how the bloody hell do you put that down? It's rather baffling. They've never encountered such a situation before. They always had some left, and so there was always a solid number to put down there. But now, Irene turns to Steve and to Brian and Brenda. Isn't this baffling? We have numbers for real quantities, not for nothing. How can nothing be a number even? Nothing is not something. But Brenda is keen to find a way out. We must find a way of representing this. And just at that moment, Bruno, our tail-waggy friend, is sniffing at something in the now chickenless coop. It's an egg. That's when Brian and Brenda, Steve and Irene all look at each other, exclaiming in unison, "Eureka!" So yes, they start depicting the fact that there's no more chickens left in the shape of an egg. So far, so good. Brenda even has a name for her record-keeping system now. Egg Cell. But one day, as Irene is preparing for market day and counting her chickens before recording it in the pre-sale cell on the board, she runs into another problem. This time, there are 12 chickens. The first time their count has gone beyond the 10 fingers normally used to count them out first. In the past, to count beyond the finger max, such as this 12, they just bank the 10 by using their symbol for it. Say X. Sorry, but no sorry, Elon. And then, with the fingers freed again, count out the other 2 and write those after the X. Say X, I. But the column they've got right now is too thin to write all of that out. Damn! That's when Steve is like, surely we have to find a simpler way instead of simply repeating the symbol for the tenor. And Brenda's like, yes, after all, we already clear out our fingers once we go beyond a 10. It's like we have no fingers being used yet. Picture at this point not a bulb, but rather an egg above their heads. And Irene then chips in, look, the column to the left of the chicken column. Isn't that where you used to record the sheep which never went beyond 4 or 5? And come to think of it, One sheep is worth 10 chicken, so why don't you simply use the sheep column, put a 1 there when you mean 10 chicken? And in the chicken column, just put the additional numbers 1, 2. Steve is like, come on, Irene. What if you had 13 chickens and then you only sold 3? Long pause, and now picture that egg from above their head neatly sliding into that post-sale chicken column.
Ground zero.
This silly story illustrates some rather profound leaps. As you've noticed, I'm talking about the invention of the zero, but also, over and above that, the place-value notation. This is, of course, the system we now use every single day, so it's hard to see what's so special or great about it. But let me try to demonstrate the value of this, in particular from our perspective of the study of innovation and progress. Consider this. This intellectual leap only happened in one of the major ancient cultures where it took more than a century to develop. And then it took the West several centuries before they accepted and eventually adopted this system. Let's then dig in and see how the whole thing works in the first place. Let's go to the very beginning of counting. Counting is said to have developed long before humans even came on the scene. Birds are known to be able to count, to a limited extent, what we'd call just a handful, up to about 4 items. Charles Darwin observed in his seminal work that higher animals could distinguish number and form. Of course, it might be interesting to see how far they can go. Amongst isolated human tribes in the modern day, researchers have observed that the simplest system is where in their language they only have 2 number words, one and many. The next step from there is groups that have 3 distinctions, 1, 2, and more than 2.
Notch it up!
There are 2 ways of evaluating the development of counting. Artifactual remains, such as notches in sticks or bones, and clues in language. There is more concrete detail we can gather from going back to our own linguistic roots, back 5,000 years to the Proto-Indo-Europeans we have covered in this series. The Proto-Indo-European words for numbers are interesting because pretty much all descendant languages have inherited those words and the general system, including Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Lithuanian, Persian, Russian, and English.
The examples mentioned here represent sound changes going back to 5,000 years. We've demonstrated how this works in episode 15. Links in episode notes.
One Proto-Indo-European word and number linguists love is kemtom, which is seen in its inherited forms with the sound changes spanning those 5,000 years in Latin, gentum, Sanskrit, satam, and our own hund. But what's perhaps more interesting is the Proto-Indo-European word, duhsont, which is seen in Lithuanian as bokstantis, Slavic as dishonce, and can you guess, our own 1,000. But we don't have commonly inherited derived numbers for bigger quantities than that. What this suggests is that the Proto-Indo-Europeans could count to thousands, but not say millions. Words for such bigger numbers developed later and independently in the daughter families.
The number crunch.
But there's another aspect we can glean from the PIE system, which, as I said, is still with us today. And this connects to the eventual development of writing down quantities as numbers. The system we inherited from Proto-Indo-European is the decimal system, PIE.
Dekm. Sanskrit, desham. Latin, decim. English, 10.
We saw how this might have come about in our story above. The fact that we have 10 fingers after which you have to start over again. So all our bigger numbers are, even in the Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, multiples of 10. So our 20 literally means 2 tens. P-I-E
Dvidkonti.
equals
Dvi.
plus.
Dikmati.
You can now see that same pattern in our 3T, 4T, and so on. So, systems of writing that evolved across the Indo-European world tended to reflect this verbal composition, already ingrained in the vocabulary. We can see this quite clearly in the Roman numerals. X is decem. XX is twice decem. Figinti, which you can trace as inherited from the Proto-Indo-European form above, with some notable sound changes. The Roman numeral sign for 100 is C, which you can see comes from centum. So the number 365, which is quite literally 300s and 160 and 5, would be written as the sum of those three quantities. CCCLXV. We can now start to see the problem here, at least from our post-Roman numeral vantage point. It starts to get unwieldy. What is especially pernicious in the Roman system, supposedly a later prevalence, is that numbers like 4 and 9 are formed by placing a 1 before a number and subtracting it from that number. IX. This feels like an unnecessary cognitive load. The brain has to conceive of a 5 or 10 in sight. Then read backwards, a step against natural reading/scanning order, and reformulate the numeric conception as 4 or 9. The ancient Greeks had a slightly better system. Even they, as the Romans, repurposed in their later version their own alphabet to denote the numbers, but with a crucial difference from the Romans. The first 9 letters denoted 1 to 9, which goes from alpha to theta in the Ionic version of the alphabet. They use the next 9 to denote the tens, 10, 20, 90, from iota to kappa, and another 9 letters for the hundreds, 100, 200 to 900. You can see where we're going here. What about beyond 999? Well, of course, they had bigger numbers. After all, they even counted the circumference of the Earth with an error margin of just around 1%.
Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a chief librarian at the Library of Alexandria.
To write down bigger numbers, they had to use all sorts of clever workarounds or patch-ups. Yes, it worked, but it was still cumbersome.
When fewer make far more.
This is where the ancient Indians come in. The ancient Indian achievement perhaps starts with setting up a distinct set of symbols for the solid numbers, just slight variations in form of what we use today, the symbols of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The immediate advantage. You just have to remember and use one set of symbols. Economy starts right at 1. But of course, this meant their position was important now. 12 is not the same as 21. But this should not be that hard to figure out. The English language is fundamentally structured on the same principle. Dog bites man is not the same as man bites dog. Contrast that again with the Roman grammatical system of having to remember several different forms of the same word, with a myriad of rules and exceptions, such that these two sentences would be Canis mordet hominem and homo mordet ganem. Of course now, you can say hominem mordet canis and still mean dog bites man. But if you've ever studied Latin in school, how many word form change rules had you to struggle to memorize to get to ensuring the right biting order? And the ancient Indian system also meant that there had to be a placeholder when you've reached 10. You are using 1 in the next position/column, but you need something to denote the void in the units column. And that is the circular symbol of 0. And with that, you can write any number denoting any quantity. As of course we do now, but as I said, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, among others, couldn't. That wasn't all, though. It also meant a whole bunch of operations on numbers. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and much more was much easier. Don't take my word for it. Just try these operations, even just addition, on quantities between 100 and 1,000 written in Roman numerals. Like quick now. What is LXXXVIII times XXXIV?
Another circular problem.
The challenge for me in conveying the significance of all this is on several epistemological counts. Firstly, and as I've often mused in these discussions of how innovation happened, it's not easy for us to go back mentally to that pre-invention state of mind. I mentioned this, for example, in my article about invention of the wheel, when I spoke of a circular problem back in episode 13, and yes, you now know what I meant there when I there said, I will touch upon another circular artifact that also poses the same sort of puzzle in a later episode. I've kept my promise. Beyond that, it's really hard to make the case for something so easy for us to take for granted as the 0, as being the huge, the massive intellectual leap it is. But if you are not convinced, consider this specifically. Even the ancient Greeks and the Mesopotamians did not make that intellectual leap. We covered the extraordinary intellectual achievements of these two great civilizations of antiquity in episode 23 and episode 24, where I made the case for how their collective achievements are among the primary cornerstones of modern science and mathematics. The 0 does pose a peculiar challenge. In fact, there are cases where a placeholder for no quantity was used by the Mesopotamians and by astronomer Claudius Ptolemy in his Almagest.
Around the year 150.
But this was only medially and transitorily. The symbol never appeared at the end of the number and never in the final result. In other words, unlike among the ancient Indians, the 0 was never elsewhere accorded status as a number in its own right. Again, the Mayans, who invented writing independently from the Old World, also had a symbol for 0 as seen in their inscriptions, but we know of no civilization that developed the concept to its logical completeness as the ancient Indians. The other important intellectual leap is the place value notation. Again, it's hard to imagine the full development of this. In my own silly fictionalization above, I simply made up a story of chicken and egg to show how someone might have had these two intellectual leaps, but in reality, it's harder to trace this back. And then, there is the question of what came first, the place value system or the 0. Indeed, that's also a chicken and egg problem. But in the end, in ancient India, we have by the year 628 of our era, the work Brahmasfuta Siddhanta by mathematician Brahmagupta, where he elaborates in great clarity and comprehensiveness the entire system. The notion of the zero and its place in the system was already taken shape in the prior centuries, such as in the transitory concepts seen in the works of Aryabhata. But it was Brahmagupta's work that shows it had fully taken shape. In the centuries after the 600s, the whole ancient Indian system of numbers was taken up by the Islamic scholars, most notably the Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, and it was first introduced to Europe around the turn of the millennium under the title Algoritmi de Numero Indorum. Al-Khwarizmi on the numerals of the Indians, or as Dixit Algoritmi.
Thus spake Al-Khwarizmi.
Please see the reference section for links to a later copy of this Latin original I've had the immense joy of reading. A certain Leonardo, not Da Vinci, is said to have played an important role in attempting to disseminate this zero-based number system in Europe in the early 1200s. A Leonardo from Pisa, who we know by his nickname, Fibonacci. Despite this, it took another 3 centuries from that point for it to catch on in Europe. In places like Renaissance Florence, the authorities at one point actively proscribed its use, and there is said to have been frequent Christian association of the zero-based number system with demons and the devil himself. But the final question is this. It may be that the West took more than half a millennium to come to terms with a number system that we universally use today, and it's true that the scholars of the Golden Age of Islam expanded on the work of the ancient Indians, and in particular, were instrumental in the introduction of this zero and place value-based number system developed by the ancient Indians to Europe. Even so, why is it that we refer to these numbers as the Arabic numerals? Shouldn't they be referred to as the Indian numerals? Furthermore, it's thanks mainly to a Persian scholar, Al-Khwarizmi, that we even have this system make its way westward the way it did. But then, at least for him, we may say he found immortality with his place in our languages as the word algorithm. At the very least, shouldn't we call it the Indo-Arabic numerals? I mean, why should the ancient Indians get zero credit